Good evening, my dear friends. I welcome you all to the Hindu and the Businessline editorial analysis on July 16, 2022. The current account deficit is at this 1.2% of the GDP and is just threatening to overtrip the previous figures, and it is going to be 2.7% of the GDP in the next quarters. So what happens is that the trade deficit is fueling the current account deficit. Trade deficit is the case where the import bills are overtripping the export bills, is more than the export bills. So what is happening is that the government has taken some measures to contain this current account deficit and the trade deficit. For example, the customs duties on import of gold has been increased to just contain the import bills of the gold, and the crude oil prices in a recessionary pressure from all over the world has eased a lot. And then what happens is that the metal prices, the industry metal prices have come down all around the world, and this recessionary pressures are just bringing down some of the developed nations to reduce their prices of petroleum. For example, Russia, they are just exporting the petroleum crude at the very cheaper rate. And what happens is that the current account deficit is just widening, and this current account deficit widening has its effects on the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is the excess of government expenditure over the revenues collected by the government. The revenues collected by the government are in the form of taxes, the GST, the direct taxes and all. And the government expenditures are in the form of the public expenditure on the developmental objectives like roads, the bridges and so on. What happens is that when the revenue collections have decreased, in May government announced a petroleum and diesel rate reduction of excise duty, and with that the petrol and diesel prices have come down. And what happens is that the the fiscal deficit is increasing. The macroeconomic parameters have receded. The macroeconomic parameters with related to the trade deficit are inflation. Then what happens is that the inflation is increasing the current account deficit. These current account deficit and inflation are macroeconomic parameters which is going to recede for some future. And when the oil prices also support us to get a favorable current account balance, the balance of payments will also be contained. The increased GST collections, and the surplus, the export duty has been made on the petrol and the diesel exports, and which will have enhanced the collection and bridge the fiscal deficit. Also, the cess on crude, that is 23,000 rupees per ton of crude, will also rein in inflation and will help the macroeconomic pressures to recede. So item by item, targeting of the inflation is being pointed out by the finance minister, which will help us a lot to contain or rein in the inflation. Then the war of Putin's Russia on Ukraine has changed the Eurocentric policies. The Eurocentric concept, once upon a time Eurocentric was the major factor influencing the rest of the world. Euro dominated more than several centuries over the rest of the world, and now the Eurocentric concept is coming back. The German word for revolution is Sittenwende. Sittenwende, the revolution is just happening. Berlin has increased the fears of security amid the war on Ukraine, and Germany's defense bills have increased from $50 billion to $100 billion. So countries of Europe, for example, Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, and the silence of NATO and European Union, the passive silence of European Union and the NATO, and the non-doing of anything on this war aspect has made some countries having some fears centric in the European existential crisis. Existential crisis happens only when the countries are fearing the onslaught from the neighboring countries or some countries like Russia. The European war that is the Russian war, is termed as Putin's war because they don't want to bring Russia into this aspect. Germany has seen so many changes from its pessimistic policy. Germany is have been nurturing a Gandhian principle of non-violence, but it has changed to favor the defense policies and having defense expenditures increasing. Earlier, the Trans-Pacific was occupied or dominated by the US-led power. However, the Eurocentric power for the Europe, by the Europe, and from the Europe is occurring. The Eurocentric policies are just dominating us earlier also. Before the American domination, Europe dictated the world. Now the digitization policies of Europe is just dominating the world, and which is going to codify the new roles for the rest of the world. Europe-led policies have always been seen as very much aggressive and very benchmark setting and standard policies, and therefore the Eurocentric aspect is coming back to the world. The European countries are getting lesser response from the rest of the world, especially India, on the aspect on war. And what happens is that Europe is concerned for its own security, and Europe-centric policies are always dominated for the European countries and for the European nations. So, by the European nations and for the European nations is going to be the Eurocentric power, which is again emerging. So, Zizek, when they asked in Germany, the revolution, the word for revolution in German, Zittewende, is raging on in Europe. Then the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum for Prosperity, which the United States President Joe Biden had announced in the Quad Summit in Japan, is taking shape. However, there are certain difficulties in dealing with this trade pact. The IPEF, for short, consists of countries like Australia, India, Japan, US, New Zealand, Philippines, then Malaysia, Brunei, and so on. These countries are just coming together with the US to counter the China's regional comprehensive economic policy and the CPTTS, that is comprehensive and progressive trans-Pacific economic policy. These two policies are there, where China is the focal point. So the lacunas, the difficulties in enforcing the trade pact, the IPF is also a trade pact, lies in there are three factors. One is that the border measures. The border measures are like reducing the customs duties. The trade barriers are come in the form of duties. So member countries should agree at reducing the customs duties to reduce the prices of export goods among the nations. This is not going to take place. The IPF is without a rate reduction of the tariff. So this is a very strange thing. Then harmonization of the rules. Harmonization of the rules among the member nations, which is not going to happen because the US-led IPF is having a policy for only countries with $50,000 per capita income, which is not possible. The harmonization of rules among the member countries is impossible. And then the second is the negotiating points revolve around certain aspects. The first is the data access and digital trade. In data access and digital trade, United States-led data policies will favor the United Nations, the United States-led some global giants of tech companies, which is India still is in the evolving stage of having data free access to rest of the countries. So this is a big lacuna. And what happens is that the next is stronger labor and environmental laws. The United States is having a partnership with Mexico in production of materials. In Mexico, the United States wants to enforce $18 per hour as the as the hourly rate, time rate. However, in Mexico, the average time rate is only $9 per hour. So, this kind of stringent enforcement of the employment laws, the labor laws, is not going to work, because in India also there are certain difficulties. Trade unions and all will object to it. The next is the global supply. The global supply breakage is only the US interest. All these matters are only US interest. So then the matter on clean energy, most of the countries are not having that much coverage of the clean fuel, that is the LPG fuel, across all sections of the population, which is going to make this a very big hurdle. And what happens is that next is the anti-corruption and bribery laws. The enforcement of money laundering and the corruption practices laws in most of the countries is, the member countries, is not possible, because some of the developing countries which are the members of this IPF are already having so many bribery and tax profiteering aspects, and the uniform laws with respect to the taxation is impossible. Then what happens is that the countries which are members of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the Comprehensive Pacific Economic Partnership, Trans-Pacific Economic Partnership, are also the members of IPF. For example, Australia, New Zealand, Brunei, Philippines, and Malaysia. They are most of the trade norms are already covered in those partnership agreements, and there is no value addition if they come to the IPF. So this US-led interests are going to be imposing the countries to have an obligatory aspect, that rather than a beneficial aspect on this IPF, which makes it a very colossal difficulty. Then there is the case of pollution. The pollution is there outdoors, created by the fossil fuels and the CHG emissions. We are not talking about the indoor pollution being suffered by women and children. The indoor pollution comes in the form of burning of wood. Still, 57% of the households in India are burning wood as the primary fuel. The clean fuel, which is the LPG, is rather used only for seldom purposes. Even after the Prime Minister's Ujjwal Yojana, the coverage of BPL families in the clean energy or the clean fuel or the LPG connections, the average household usage is only 3 cylinders per annum. The national average is 6.5 cylinders per annum. But the BPL families, they are using only 3 cylinders per annum. So what happens is the wood is mostly used as the fuel for cooking. What happens is that the gases emitted by the wood are particulates, then the polycyclic organic gases, then formaldehyde, carbon monoxide, which creates respiratory problems. Then there is the case of COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders. It is estimated that 4 lakhs people die every year because of this indoor pollution. The indoor pollution is not minded, because most of the households are having the yearning members as men. They just ignore the aspects of indoor pollution, because the most of the women are only cooking in households. What happens is that the congested kitchens, the asbestos sheet kitchens, these are fueling the increase of pollution indoors. So which affects the health of the women and children members of the family. Friends, I have come to the conclusion of today's editorial analysis. Meet you tomorrow with some more topics. Till then, bye, good night, take care.